Mr. President, I rise today to speak in support of the USA Freedom Act of 2015. I am a proud co-sponsor of this bicameral, bipartisan bill, which brings much-needed reforms to the federal government's surveillance programs, including an end to a bulk data collection program that the intelligence community has said isn't necessary, that the public has said that they don't support, and that the Second Circuit has ruled as unlawful. I am particularly proud to have developed the bill's transparency provisions with my friend, Senator Dean Heller of Nevada, and we are greatly indebted to Senator Lee and to Senator Leahy for their leadership and their tireless work. Americans understand, as I do, their job here is to strike an appropriate balance, making sure, on the one hand, that we are safeguarding our national security without trampling on our citizens' fundamental privacy rights on the other hand. But the public can't know if we succeed in striking that balance if they don't even have the most basic information about our major surveillance programs. That's why my focus has been on transparency, because I want to make sure that the American people are able to decide for themselves whether we are getting this right. I support the USA Freedom Act because it moves us in the right direction on all of these fronts. Now, on June 1, several national security authorities will expire. The House acted responsibly and passed USA Freedom, a bill that reflects the combined efforts and agreement of Republicans and Democrats, members of the intelligence and law enforcement communities, and advocates for privacy and civil liberties, as well as members of the tech sector and business communities. This legislation ensures that the necessary authorities continue in force through 2019, and it makes important reforms that will actually improve national security. And you don't need to take my word for that. The Director of National Intelligence and the Attorney General have told us in no uncertain terms that we ought to pass the USA Freedom Act, and promptly. Yet some of my colleagues are attempting to present us with a choice between reauthorization of the soon-to-expire authorities with no reforms whatsoever, or complete expiration of those authorities. That is profoundly unfortunate, because we have a compromised bill that has the overwhelming support and was overwhelmingly approved by the House of Representatives, a vote of 338 to 88, and draws broad-based support from business, from civil society, and within the government. I believe that the only thing that would stop this bill from garnering similar strong bipartisan support here in the Senate is if Republican leaders who oppose this bill pressure my Republican colleagues to filibuster, and I really hope that does not happen. I hope it does not happen because USA Freedom's reforms represent real and meaningful progress. The bill ends the old program for the bulk collection of telephone metadata, which, according to reports discussed at a hearing last year, principally gathered call records for landlines. It replaces that program with a more targeted approach that permits the collection of call detail records, including prospective collection of those records. You do a warrant, you collect those prospectively, based on the government's reasonable, articulable suspicion of a link to international terrorism. And I believe that is a much more sensible approach. I know that some of my colleagues disagree. Last November, one of my colleagues suggested that bulk collection is preferable to a targeted approach because Americans' privacy would be at risk if the government were, quote, going to have to go to those companies and ask for the data, unquote. But of course, no matter what, we have to go to the companies and ask them for the data. The records at issue here are the phone companies' business records. That's what they are. I should also note that those companies have both legal and business records for why they retain and protect these records as they do. From the potential for billing disputes to commercial analytics to regulatory concerns, the FCC regulations require them to hold on to telephone toll records for 18 months. None of that is changing. And it bears emphasizing that the relationship USA Freedom calls for between phone companies and the government is nothing new. Our nation's law enforcement and intelligence agencies have long worked with phone companies to obtain specific records, either historic or prospective records, when conducting domestic criminal investigations or carrying out sensitive national security investigations like FISA wiretaps. So we've been doing this for a long time. So the intelligence community, national security, and law enforcement experts and American businesses, not to mention the United States House of Representatives, they all understand that we've got to strike the right balance. We need to safeguard our national security, but we need to do it in ways that don't unduly tread on privacy and civil liberties. And leaders across these different public and private sectors managed to come together to strike that balance in the USA Freedom Act. And that is where my work with Senator Heller comes in. We recognize that when the public lacks even a rough sense of the scope of the government's surveillance programs, that they have no way of knowing if the government is getting that balance right. So there needs to be more transparency. Since the Snowden revelations came to light 2 years ago, a steady stream of news reports has provided details about NSA programs that collect information about both foreign nationals and the American people. Despite these disclosures, it remains impossible for the American people to get even a basic sense of the real size and scope of these programs. Americans still don't know the number of people whose information has been collected under these programs. They have no sense of the extent to which U.S. persons are affected. In particular, they have no way of knowing how often the government has searched that information, like call detail records of Americans. Senator Heller and I crafted transparency provisions to make sure that Americans get that kind of information. That way, the American people can better judge the government's surveillance programs for themselves. Under USA Freedom, the government will be required to issue detailed annual reports for each of the surveillance authorities at issue. Importantly, the government will have to tell the public how many people have had their information collected, and for certain authorities, like those permitting the targeted collection of call detail records or the communications of foreigners abroad, the government will also have to say how many times it has run searches of Americans' data. The USA Freedom Act doesn't just require the government to be more transparent, we also make it possible for American businesses to provide their customers with more information about what they are asked to turn over to the government. This is not only good for transparency, it's good for the economy. It has been estimated that the Snowden revelations are costing American companies billions of dollars because people have lost trust in those companies, often assuming that all companies are handing over all of their information to the government. So, by allowing companies to report the size and scope of the government's requests, the public can get a better sense of what information is actually being turned over, and the bill makes clear that a company that has not received any national security requests from the government is free to say so. All of this will calm fears both here and abroad and allow American companies to better compete with their foreign counterparts. The provisions that Senator Heller and I wrote will expand the options that companies have to issue their own transparency reports and allow companies to issue those reports more quickly. But we also listen to the intelligence community to make sure that we're striking the right balance and ensuring that ongoing investigations are not jeopardized by additional transparency. Now look, to get the broad bipartisan support that we needed, Senator Heller and I had to compromise a great deal. We didn't get everything we wanted when we initially negotiated our provisions last year, and we had to compromise further still this year, particularly with regard to government reporting under Section 702, which authorizes the collection for intelligence purposes of communications of foreign persons abroad. I am disappointed that the bill doesn't include all of the requirements we agreed on last year and that were included in the Senate bill last Congress, which got 58 votes. But I am committed to pressing my colleagues to revisit this issue in the future, hopefully before the sunset of Section 702 in 2017. That, of course, is the internet traffic of foreign persons abroad who are suspected of being terrorists. But in the meantime, the good news is that after all the give and take, our provisions that did get included in the bill will usher in a new era of transparency about our nation's surveillance agencies. This will allow the public to see on an annual basis whether the government really makes good on its promise to end bulk collection. And they will give those of us in Congress important tools as we work to continually improve our country's laws. The transparency provisions are an essential part of USA freedom, and the bill overall is a step in the right direction for reforming our nation's surveillance laws. It is a step that the House has already taken on an overwhelmingly bipartisan basis. It is a step that the Senate should take as well. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.